this podcast, Andy Palmer from Tamr talks about the emerging world of data ops and what businesses could do to succeed. So stay tuned. So welcome everyone to Future of Data podcast. This is an exciting session today. So today we have one of the guests that very few times we are fortunate enough to get, who actually represent the future of data, who has a good stake in it and give us a very sort of holistic perspective of what's going on. So we have Andy Palmer, co-founder and CEO of Tamr. Let me give you a brief introduction. So Andy is a serial entrepreneur who specialized in accelerating the growth of mission-driven startups. Andy has helped found and or fund more than 50 innovative companies in technologies, healthcare, and life science. Andy's unique blend of strategy, perspective, and disciplined tactical execution is suited to environment where uncertainty is the rule rather than the exception. Andy has a specific passion for projects at the intersection of computer science and life science. Most recently, Andy co-founded Tamr, a next-gen data curation company, and Koa Labs, a startup club in the heart of Harvard Square, Cambridge, Mass. And some of the specialities that Andy has is software, sales, marketing, web services, service-oriented architecture, venture capital, bootstrapping, founding teams, venture capital firm, and so on and so forth. He is a world-class stage venture capitalist as well. With that, Andy, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
Beautiful. And I think to our folks, I also want to say that I sort of missed out on your introduction, Andy, is that if you are a startup in Boston and you're in data science, like, we are fortunate to have you, Andy, on that ecosystem. You're always sort of available for us. You have always helped a lot of the startups by giving your time and advice and suggestions. So I do appreciate everything and anything you do to keep this ecosystem really thriving. I do appreciate that.
Oh, thanks. Appreciate that. It's a lot of fun.
Yes. So let's walk through your journey, Andy. Like, so if you can walk our listeners and viewers through your past and what bring you to the data science and what keeps you excited about this, that'll be fascinating.
You bet. Well, I'm a software engineer by training, and at some point in my career, recognized I was never going to be as good of an engineer as the computer scientists I like to hang around with, and so I morphed into sort of a tech savvy business person. And then in the 90s was a pretty good time to be in software and especially distributed systems. And so did a bunch of startups, most notably Trilogy and PC Order, as well as a company called Bow Street. And, I really enjoyed the time, and it was really very fortunate. We built a lot of software, sold a lot of software, made a bunch of money. But I definitely had this feeling at the end of the 1990s, which is kind of like, how is the world any better or different? And that sort of pulled me into the life sciences here in Boston. There's an amazing biotech community, and was really privileged to be a part of the team that started Infinity Pharmaceuticals. And it was an amazing experience with a fantastic team of people that, I'm still close to today. And it was really amazingly powerful to work on a team whose mission was to make a difference in the lives of patients by discovering important new cancer therapies. And but one of the unexpected consequences of working in the life sciences, when we started Infinity, was this experience of working closely with large-scale data systems and analytics. That in many ways, what goes on in the life sciences, or what has been going on for the last 30 years, is actually a precursor to what the rest of commercial companies are doing with data and analytics today. And so part of my unexpected outcome from working both at Infinity and then later on at Novartis was learning what's required to do next-gen data and analytics at very large scale at a much lower cost. And this is a part of what inspired, me to work with my partner, Mike Stonebreaker, in starting Vertica and in doing a number of other projects, as well as eventually starting Tamr.
Interesting. Thank you for a walkthrough. So currently you are involved with Tamr. So if you can walk us through what Tamr does and what are they helping with?
Yeah, Tamr's focus is on data curation and unification at very large scale. And Mike and I had experienced over and over again this problem when people were building and deploying large aggregated data systems, data warehouses, for lack of a better term, that the key bottleneck was how quickly and dynamically they could instrument new sources into those aggregated data systems. The hypothesis that if you applied modern machine learning techniques to the integration of the data and use a probabilistic approach to modeling data, that you could add new data sources very, very quickly to your infrastructure and use the power of machine learning models to actually pre-prepare the data for all the people that needed to use that data and consume it. And so we did an academic project at MIT for 2 years. And then we started the company about 5 years ago, and based on that research at MIT. And now I think we're to the point where we've proven it at fairly large scale that this kind of probabilistic modeling of data sources in large enterprises works incredibly well and delivers tremendous business value. When you have these unified views of key data entities inside of large companies, there's a lot of low-hanging analytic fruit to be picked just by organizing the data more effectively.
Interesting. And if you can walk us through your role in Tamr, like what do you do, or how do you spend your day in Tamr? We'll resume after a short break. This part of the podcast is brought to you by First Friday Fair, fastest AI-powered way to find your next opportunity. Check out the website firstfridayfair.tao.ai and find your next dream job. Let's get back to the podcast.
I pride myself on founder culture, and Mike and myself and our partner Ehab, who's a professor up at Waterloo, Ehab Ilyas, along with a core group of great engineers, Alex Pagan, George Pascalis, and Dan Bruckner. We all came together, worked on the academic project together, and then started the company together. And we really try and maintain that founder culture. So technically, I'm the CEO, but I really pride myself first and foremost on being a founder. And the benefit of being a founder, unlike any other sort of functional title that you might take, is that it's an immutable role. That no matter what changes in the company, you're always going to be a co-founder. And I really pride myself on that. And it's fun because you get to work on whatever's most important in the company at any given point in time. And I've got a great leadership team here at Tamr, and they do such a fantastic job that a big part of my responsibility is to stay out of their way and help get them whatever they need in order to be successful.
Interesting. Thank you for walking us through that. I think so data right now is pretty much what IT used to be a couple of maybe decades back now. So I think you're the guy where, like, I have heard the word data ops from you. Let's say, what do you mean by data ops? Like, if you can walk us through, and that will be awesome.
So we've seen this trend emerging over the last 5 years. And, I saw it as when I was running software and data engineering over at Novartis's research group, as well as at Infinity. And the trend is, a desire for a lot more people to use a lot more of the data that exists inside of the company, any given company. And so it's very similar when DevOps emerged in the late 90s and early 2000s. The goal of DevOps was to deliver feature velocity for for the internet companies, enable them to build, test, and release software more quickly that would differentiate them. Data ops is very similar, but the goal of data ops is to build, test, and release data and deliver it to everyone inside of a large company to enable analytic velocity inside of their companies. Get more people prosecuting more data and using that in their day-to-day work with a higher degree of reliability. And so inside of this broad concept and vision of data ops, there are a number of different key components that are still in the process of emerging. So one of the key capabilities that you need is raw source cataloging. So this is projects like Apache Atlas and vendors like Alation and Waterline are delivering really great commercial and open source solutions for doing raw source cataloging. At the other end of the spectrum, closer to the analysts and the consumers, you have self-service data prep. And so these are tools from companies like Alteryx and Trifacta and Paxata that enable each analyst to actually join a small number of data sources together in order to serve whatever analytic purpose they have. Now, in between those raw source catalogs and the self-service prep tools, there are a number of different functions that are required in a healthy data ops ecosystem. One of those things is large-scale data pipelining that's highly automated. And one of my favorite projects there is the Apache Airflow project, which originally started at Airbnb. Many of our customers are increasingly relying on Airflow as a primary tool set for orchestrating their Python pipelines. The second set of tooling that's required is the privacy, security, and governance. And one of my favorite vendors there is Calibra, for example. And then there are these other functions. Tamr provides a function that is logical data modeling and data unification that complements the data pipelining and the data governance work. And so it's the combination of best of breed tools in each one of these areas that, when combined together and through RESTful interfaces, actually gives you this data ops kind of capability inside of your company. And I think it enables the chief data officers inside of these companies to become like the data broker inside of their enterprise. And one of the coolest parts about it is that, unlike 10 or 15 years ago, where you had to buy this kind of stuff from one big vendor that was going to sell you a huge platform, now you get to cherry pick these best of breed tools from really cool vendors and assemble the things that work for you in a way that works for you. So very much like the DevOps ecosystem works, where you get to pick for source code management, whether you want to use GitHub or Subversion. You get to pick all kinds of stuff out of the Atlassian suite or New Relic. And you combine those things in order to do modern DevOps. We think that data ops ecosystem is going to be very similar, where it's a combination of tools that are loosely coupled together. And some of those tools will be proprietary pieces of software. Some of them will be free and open source.
Interesting.
So I think it's a really exciting time, because the amount of money that big companies spend on their legacy data infrastructure is very, very large. And I think that most big companies have the sense that they're not really getting the bang for the buck, and that they're looking to do something significantly different.
Interesting. So, like, at what time in the inception of a company should I worry about something called data ops? So what would be that perfect pivotal moment for me?
We'll resume after a short break. This part of the podcast is brought to you by First Friday Fair, fastest AI-powered way to find your next opportunity. Check out the website firstfridayfair.tao.ai and find your next dream job. Let's get back to the podcast.
Well, it depends a lot. I mean, the cool part is in startups, and a lot of the startups that I work with, they're already doing data ops. Maybe they don't call it that, but again, the very fact that something like Airflow sort of came out of Airbnb is a great example. That modern internet companies and startups, the real advantage that they have is they have a greenfield, and so they get to build things from scratch. And if you look at Cloudera and Hortonworks and the sort of the popularity of HDFS over the last 10 plus years, it really all started with the big internet companies wanting to do something else instead of using traditional relational database systems to manage their log files. And so I think you have a similar pattern here, where younger companies will develop these design patterns, again, sort of loosely called data ops, to do things like automated data pipelining. And then bigger companies over time will have the ability to adopt those and deploy them at large scale, and take advantage, kind of stand on the shoulders of a lot of the work that these big internet companies have done. And some small companies, like another one of my favorite vendors in the data ops ecosystem is Data Kitchen here in Boston. The Data Kitchen guys have this incredible automated data pipelining tool set, and very, very cool stuff. So for companies like Data Kitchen and Trifacta and ourselves and Alteryx, we all live data ops every single day. And then for big companies, like many of our customers at Tamr, whether GSK is a great reference, where they have an amazing data ops ecosystem at GSK that consists of 11 different vendors, each of which brings some combination of best of breed tools. And the chief data officer at GSK, Mark Ramsey, has done an amazing job of building a next-gen infrastructure at a very, very low cost that provides next-gen data functionality inside of GSK. And we see lots and lots of other big companies that are doing a similar kind of a thing, whether it's in biopharmaceuticals or discrete manufacturing or financial services.
Interesting. And I think when he was talking about sort of how this industries are shaping up, I think one thing I was thinking about is one of my interactions with one of the CIOs, and he gave me pretty much his perspective on what's happening, and his outlook was, Vishal, you know what, the culture of how organizations are shaped is changing nowadays. So we are seeing a lot more shadow groups emerging. Almost every department has their own shadow, and what keeps me sort of barely sleeping through the night is I cannot manage my sort of load of stuff with this chaos. And now you talk about DevOps, like structuring them, and sort of data ops. You coined a beautiful term to help them. And on the other side, there's a data exhaust going on. Like everything you touch spew out enormous amount of data. And his panic attack. His panic attack is like, I'm already losing that battle between the data and the DevOps. So what's your thought on that?
Well, I really think that, anytime there is change, there's anxiety. And I think we are going through a massive change. And this belief that there is a huge amount of data that's being generated as exhaust from all the business process automation we've all done for the last 40 years. And that there's this desire to consume that data in useful ways, but it's really hard and complicated. I think that's it's kind of where we are. And now over the next 5 or 10 years, I think it's going to change dramatically. And the key here is that the enterprise needs to pick up and learn some of these lessons from the modern internet companies. So if you remember way back in the mid 90s, we're both probably old enough to remember, the first days of Yahoo, and Yahoo had this, sort of set of organization or classifications of websites on the left-hand side of their page. And they had thousands of library scientists at Yahoo that were employed, and their job was to go to websites and say, oh, this is a finance page, and this is a travel page. And then those classifications that were manually developed actually made their way into those lists of websites that Yahoo provided. And along comes Google and says, well, we think there's a better way, which is to use modeling, essentially, to create these indexes that are going to match all the web content that's out there in the world with whatever search terms people type in. And very, very quickly, that model-based or probabilistic approach sort of overtook this deterministic method for organizing data on the modern web. One of the things that we believe at Tamr is that there's a similar opportunity inside of large companies. Their primary asset is not web pages, it's tabular data sets that are generated from this exhaust from business process automation. And that when you use models to organize this data, you can actually make it very generally and easily available to lots of people in a unified way. But what goes on at most companies right now, as your friend described, is a very deterministic approach. It's the same as all of those library scientists trying to manually classify every single web page in the modern web. And it's just not something that can be done with manual effort. Now, changing that behavior pattern inside of these big companies is hard because there's a lot of people that are employed to do this deterministic curation and manipulation of data. And so replacing those, all that work that those people do with models and then finding other higher value add work for those folks to do is a huge change, not only for the people, but also the organizations that they inhabit. And it's going to take probably decades to kind of play out. But when we've done this at large scale at places like GE or GSK or Littelfuse or the Creative Artist Agency, the impact of organizing this data is liberating for these companies. And actually, that frustration that your friend has turns into enthusiasm and for the opportunity that data inside of these enterprises provide, because you can get a lot of benefit very, very quickly. At GE, we were able to sort of realize many tens of millions, even hundreds of millions of dollars of cost savings very quickly just by organizing the data in their procurement, on the procurement side of their business. So, there's this low-hanging fruit, analytic fruit to be picked if you just organize your data using this model-based or probabilistic approach.
We'll resume after a short break. This part of the podcast is brought to you by First Friday Fair, fastest AI-powered way to find your next opportunity. Check out the website firstfridayfair.tao.ai and find your next dream job. Let's get back to the podcast.
Interesting. So, from your perspective, what are some of the steps that I as an executive on, say, a mid to large size corporation who is going through this panic attack could do to sort of, besides doing say meditation or yoga, that could help me actually get something done?
Yeah. So the first thing that I think is really important is to recognize that your data is an asset. And, as an asset of your company, it's no different than money. And big companies don't leave their cash laying around under the desks of all the people that work in their company. And yet when it comes to managing their data, that's kind of how a lot of people treat it. And so the first step to take in your organization is to declare that data is an asset. The second thing is to figure out what you have. And that starts with raw source cataloging. As I mentioned, Apache Atlas or Alation, Waterline, very natural tools to use as you start cataloging what tabular data assets are available inside of your company. And then as you do that, you also want to reach out and look analytically for use cases that where people desire to consume data in a very impactful way, usually to either save money or to help the company grow faster. And as you cherry pick the best analytic use cases and the data sources that are required out of your catalog, you can start to prosecute those. And very much like the work that we've done at some of these very large companies, once you have one or two examples where you've been successful in saving tens or hundreds of millions of dollars or helping the company grow much faster, it's very compelling, and then everybody kind of gets in and wants to do it. But
interesting.
Going through that process though is a lot of work and a lot of change, and you have to do it once or twice first. And so we really encourage our customers when they're starting off, take a very agile approach. Don't do a big boil the ocean project. Do something where you can get analytic benefit in small number of months, not quarters or years.
Interesting. And from your vantage point, what are some of the things that you have seen businesses not getting when it comes to sort of managing the data properly? What are some of the common mistakes or some sort of common areas where you see businesses could rather do a better job, and from what you are seeing right now?
Yeah, so there's a long list, and having been a CIO and been on the buying side of these kinds of technologies as many times as on the selling side, these are my problems as well, and I share my customers' frustration as they deal with these problems every single day. I think that one of the largest things is that many people tend to focus on software rather than data, and as one of my good friends who is a chief data officer at a Fortune 50 company likes to say, data is the queen. Data is truly this asset, and it's easy to sort of get distracted on software engineering and all these things that you could go build. But the real asset is the data, and I've made this mistake myself, focusing too much on the software, not as much on the data engineering and the data science. And so I think that's a first, sort of potential pitfall is don't worry about the software so much, focus on the data itself. The second thing is talent in tooling. That I think that the reason why a lot of these big companies are in the position that they're in terms of the sort of lack of flexibility and agility in their data infrastructure is because they're wedded to some of these legacy technologies and the drag coefficient that's created by those. I think you have to abandon some of that and look for new people that are, sort of more cutting edge and are changing assumptions. And if you do the same thing, right, pay Teradata or Informatica a ton of money over and over again, that you're going to get the same results. Like, you're not going to get anything different than you've had over the last 20 or 30 years. That if you really want to move the needle, you have to, take some risks and put some money behind some of these early vendors. And when you do that, there will be times when things don't work, and there'll be a lot of uncertainty and things, but there will also be potentially very, very large wins that you probably couldn't have gotten with the more traditional vendors and the more dogmatic technologies.
Interesting. And I think that's a very valid point, right? So this ecosystem is shifting, and many of those businesses are still sort of hung on to business as usual sort of infrastructure, and it's very difficult to now go and pick the next shiny object when sort of your critical components are at stake and they're sort of churning out a lot of revenue for you. So if you are an executive in that sort of ecosystem, and you are stuck with this mindset of, hey, doing business as and sort of you want to get to the next shiny object, but you're not getting sort of buy-in that you want, what are some of the thoughts that you could suggest to that particular stuck individual, sort of how they can create that buy-in to experiment with folks like interesting innovative solutions?
Yeah, I think you have to act very agilely in the short term and like try a lot of stuff, but you have to have sort of a long-term perspective to this. I was talking to a CIO a month or two ago who described a 4-year process to unhook Teradata from their infrastructure. And they were 3.5 years into this, so they were getting close to the end of, sort of their dependence on Teradata. And they, it was a significant spend for them, more than $100 million a year kind of money that they were spending. And so they were going to take some of that benefit as savings. They were going to take some of it, maybe 25 or 30 million as, the infrastructure required to replace whatever Teradata was doing before. And then they freed up another $50 million to go work on cool new stuff. And so that person, had to make that decision 4 years ago and had to believe that it was possible, and then had to do a series of things to sort of replace all the things that Teradata was doing. And so, he had a very long-term view, and he also took a lot of short-term risks and a lot of experiments that paid off in a big way, letting him run his infrastructure, this is feature for a quarter of the cost. And so it's a very, very challenging thing to do in big companies. And I think that so many CIOs are burdened with 80-90% of their spend in legacy. I know I was, that it's really hard to get out of that cycle. And but the time is right to do it. There are enough cool new tools, and they've developed well enough that you can actually get away with it today. Whereas maybe 10 years ago when I was doing a bunch of this stuff at Novartis, it was a lot harder. It was possible, but a lot harder. And so I think it's getting easier every quarter as the data ops ecosystem kind of evolves.
Interesting. And I think so. I was just thinking about one of my interaction with one of the Fortune 50 senior executive around. So he was telling me that they acquire about, I think, 17 companies every year. And they successfully integrate 3, and they have a backlog of like 21 years. And this is many of these companies that they probably acquire will not even, like, they will go obsolete before they even get to that. Yeah. When you have that much craziness going on, and then the other sort of conversation is all the businesses nowadays are getting epified. They're sort of in a very small, crisp use cases that they're working on. Yeah. It's a nightmare scenario for IT. Right, so it's difficult. They have to do a lot more sort of working through this diverse ecosystem. And you coined a great term, data ops, right? So I think one thing that I was recalling from the conversation was, you say, what if I just get insights from those businesses till they figure out their thing, right? At least I should know. So what's your thought on that?
Yeah, well, we've done this with a bunch of our customers. The post M&A integration, use case for Tamr is very strong because, Tamr is really designed to make it really easy to add new data sources and, minimizes the amount of manual effort required to get a unified view. And so the first thing you want to do after you acquire a new company is, well, I want to see the, unified view of all the customers, the acquired companies in mind, and all the suppliers and all the things we buy from them and all the things we sell to their customers. And so with Tamr, because it makes that an automated and a model-driven process, you can do these kinds of activities in days and weeks instead of having to go out and hire consultants that are going to take months or years or to do this thing. And when you make it when you make the velocity that high, you find that whether in the M&A side, if you're trying to realize spend optimization opportunities across the newly acquired company, these become things you can do in less than 3 or 4 weeks. And when you can do things that fast on the business side that are enabled by better technology, it really empowers people, right? Because people in big companies, they're just sort of fatigued with everything taking quarters and years, and they change jobs and all this stuff. And so if you can't do something fast, like it's kind of really hard to sort of keep it going. And so we see this a lot with Tamr, and that design pattern of adding new data sets really quick, popular data sets really quickly. It's no different than, again, when new websites come online on the modern web, you just know that Google is going to index them and make them available to you. You just assume it. The same thing should be true inside of big companies. When you go and acquire a company, it should be a normal course of practice that newly acquired data, especially around key entities like customers and suppliers and employees, that stuff automatically gets integrated and is available for analysis very, very quickly, like within days. And
Interesting.
You can't do it that fast with manual methods or deterministic methods, right? It has to be automated and model driven.
Interesting. So from your perspective, like if you consider the same use case, right? So do you think that something like data ops would gain a lot more credibility and traction compared to DevOps, or DevOps will sort of lose sight when it's too much chaotic and you can't even engage anymore? So what do you think?
Yeah, I think data ops is really the very logical evolution of DevOps and data engineering. And so if I was drawing a picture of it, it would be, data engineering on one side and DevOps on the other, and data ops in between, kind of overlapping both of them. And so I think there's a very logical evolution here. It's not instead of or in replace of, but, as people figured out how to use automation to aggressively build, test, and continuously build, test, and release software, I think with data ops, they will start to figure out how to automatically build, test, and release data and continuously do that inside of their environments. And even the popularity of architectures like Lambda and Kafka, I think are a great, sort of precursor for modern data ops. That it's the kind of design pattern where you're doing things both in streaming and as well as batch at the same time in an integrated way. That it's sort of a core principle inside of data ops. And so there's all these trends that have been developing independently, people doing work that makes sense and manifesting those into open source projects, into all kinds of tools. And these things are sort of now sort of merging together into what people will call data ops.
Interesting. And from your vantage point, probably from Tamr end, so if you talk to a lot of these clients, what are some of the things that you're pleasantly surprised with that businesses get it? Like, what are some of the things that you could say, hey, I don't have to sell you this now. You pretty much you are selling with that back.
Well, there was a period of like 4 or 5 years ago when we started Tamr. I used to go around and do this evangelical thing about data as an asset, where I would say, well, you're the chief data officer, the chief information officer, you should be like the CFO, but for data and information. And so if you go and ask this chief financial officer, where does your money come from? What money do you have? And where is it being spent? They could show me in great detail where every penny goes and where it comes from and what they have. But on the CIO and CDO side, it was like crickets. We have a lot of Oracle databases and we have a lot of file stores, and there's some people that use analytics, but we kind of don't know it, and we have a bunch of models. So there was no sort of systematic approach or much less automated approach to doing this stuff. Today, many of the customers that we talk to, they start by saying, we're interested in managing our data as an asset, and we've begun cataloging our raw data sources. And so I think these big companies are figuring out that they have to do this. They have to use their data as an asset. If for no other reason, there's a competitive dynamic. I mean, credit Amazon was sort of, waking everyone up to believing that they need to use data and AI as a competitive weapon in their business. And so they're starting to do this. Now, the challenge sometimes is that when big companies prosecute this, they start with where the data comes from, and then they catalog that, and then they kind of move down to where people are consuming the data. The challenge is that sometimes you can get, just cataloging the data can take years. And so you really have to, think about these things in a very broad way, in a very long-term way, these capabilities inside of data ops, but also you have to prosecute and build out projects that go cradle to grave from data all the way through to analytic outcome, and do that in short number of months. And sometimes in big companies, they can kind of polarize into either doing things that are fiercely tactical or doing things that are too big, boil the ocean kind of things. And so data ops done really well is a combination of both long-term core principles for the infrastructure you need in the long term to manage data as an asset very broadly, and also the prosecution of specific analytic use cases where you're going to get value and make sure that the infrastructure that you're building is actually what people need and the sources that people care about, and that are going to have the biggest impact on your business.
Interesting. And like, so in data science world nowadays, like, what are some of the big opportunities that you're seeing that still sort of are not being served, that you think businesses or maybe the future startups could address?
I think that there are a couple of things that are really key that are going on. The first one is understanding privacy and governance. And one of the problems that I think the traps that people fall into with regards to privacy and governance is thinking about it as an activity of control. So sort of naturally say, well, we govern the data and we ensure privacy by controlling who has access to it. And I think it's a bit of a red herring. There's so much data and it flows in so many different ways that if you start a project believing that you can control it all and control access, it's almost never ending. It's infinite. You kind of never get there. I think instead, it's much healthier to focus on how data is used and consumed and make sure that you're aligning the consumption of data with appropriate use. So lots of logging about who's using data and how they're using it. And then over time, mapping that back into policies about governance in terms of who's entitled to use data for what purpose. And so if you invest more in understanding and managing the appropriate use at the point of data consumption, that's a very powerful way to get to better data governance and privacy. If you invest in trying to control access to data, I think it's a bit of a dead end. You almost always never get to the kind of control that you need. So the second sort of thing that people struggle with is this idea of data pipelining at large scale. And many companies, most of their data pipelines are written in Python. They're very idiosyncratic and they're relatively unmanaged. And so this is where I think tools like Airflow, Apache Airflow and Data Kitchen, I think are really, really powerful tools that enable you to do automated data pipelining in a much more manageable way. And again, sort of dovetails into this discussion around governance that if you can you automate the data pipelines in a reasonably consistent way, then you get all this visibility and control over how data flows through those pipelines, and that gives you much better, greater opportunities for governance and control of privacy. And so, the enemy of great governance and appropriate use is idiosyncratic data pipelining. And, we're in the earliest days of people in big companies kind of getting their heads around that.
Interesting. I think so. On that note, I definitely. So one thing that I am curious to learn from you is, So we are seeing this AI phenomenon nowadays. A lot of sensors are using AI. And I was talking to one of the executive at GE at one point in the past that, hey, like I wear a Fitbit, or I wear sort of an I watch, and I just go to Europe, and then I go to India, and I go to wherever. Every time I land on a country, the data drops in, data drops up, and you are in the regulatory environment of that sort of ecosystem nowadays. And I think you are pointing out a very interesting point on the governance of a lot of this perspective. So how much of this data ops, like from your perspective, is really burning businesses down because of this sort of boundaries and sharing and sort of those, like, and on the other side, AI has maybe no respect for some of these boundaries. And you raise an interesting point. If your model is idiosyncratic, like it's very difficult. If your model has the loopholes, AI has nothing to do with it. It's just executing on your framework. So how much it's throwing businesses on the loop of, maybe I won't be able to win this battle of managing my data properly.
Yeah, so I think pragmatics work really well here, and so many people are so excited about AI, and as I started my career in AI back in the mid '80s, and so I feel very close to these concepts. But as Andrew Lau likes to say, and as I've heard many people for many years have said that in the AI community that you don't want to put the AI cart before the data horse, and putting your data first is what makes the AI really powerful. And so, and the great examples of this, I mean, you don't have to go any further than neural networks, which there were some good examples, but none as powerful as Google Translate. In terms of the use of neural networks. And the reason why Google Translate really worked was they had all this data at very large scale that was, high enough quality to really make the neural networks work. And so I think the same principle sort of applies very broadly to data inside of companies that is generated as exhaust inside of all these data silos, that if you don't have your data kind of organized in a reasonable way and of a sufficient quality, you're not really going to get the bang for the buck out of any of the AI techniques and these algorithms. The other thing that you allude to is this question of control and the flow of data across different boundaries, whether those are geographic boundaries or company boundaries. And I think GDPR is kind of the most popular current reference for that. And we have a lot of customers that are very, Global 2000 companies that are interested in doing this data unification. We see this a lot. And there's I think the real challenge here, again, is more focusing around use and consent. And one of our customers at Toyota Motors in Europe is a great example where we help them unify data from lots of different geographies across all of Europe. And it's a very challenging thing to do because they have very heterogeneous dealer management systems across Europe. But you want to provide a single unified view of their customers, primarily to serve those customers. And a key part of doing that data unification and complying with all the appropriate regulations is getting the consent from the person who generates the data, the customer themselves, that you can use that data in order to serve them as a customer. And you can use it in an integrated way and across all these different boundaries. And so I think one of the things that's missing from the GDPR discussions and the way that most people refer to it, they think of it as putting up walls across these boundaries. And actually, it really is much more about getting consent from the people who generated the data and own the data, theoretically, or responsible for the data, getting their consent to use the data in a way that's going to benefit them, regardless of whether that means taking it across boundaries or combining it with other data. And so I really hope in the next 5 years that the technology vendors, as well as large customers themselves, they start to change the emphasis from control over to consent for how data is used and defining appropriate use for data in various contexts.
Interesting. Now let's spend a few minutes on your journey as an entrepreneur, building this amazing data science company and supporting these data science companies. So what are some of commonalities that if you could pick out from your successes and any successes you backed, that you could share, that really sort of build up your perception of, hey, if any startup or any business has attained these sort of qualities, they are doing a right thing, and probably they're on a right track.
Yeah. Well, I think this is, one of the companies and products that my partner Mike Stonebreaker and I are most proud of is a company called Vertica that we co-founded back in 2004. And we're extremely proud of the technology and the impact that it's had on the industry, as well as, and most importantly, probably the benefit that it's created for all of their customers at very large scale. And so Mike and I believe that even though we spend a lot of our time on sort of the academic side of computer science, that any of these ideas or design patterns, unless it benefits customers at large scale, it's really difficult, to justify why it should exist. And so Mike and I, we think that one of the characteristics of the best companies is that they are, really irrationally committed to what their customers want and need. And we really try and practice that at companies like Vertica and Tamr, where we prioritize what our customers want. It's really hard to do in B2B tech because any one person inside of a large company might have an idiosyncratic view of what it is they want, what's important to them, and you go from the people on the ground, all both on the technical and the business side, all the way up through to the senior executives and the CEOs of these companies, and it represents a plethora of different perspectives about what's most important and what they need and want from their information infrastructure. And so one of the challenges, and I think one of the things that differentiates great B2B tech companies, is the ability to take into account all of those different personas and perspectives and opinions about what they need and want, and balance them as you're building out technical infrastructure and delivering solutions to customers, so that the company gets the broadest benefit it possibly can and the highest ROI possible over a long period of time. And most companies are forced into this decision where you do something that's much smaller and focused, and you have a more transactional relationship with your customer. Many SaaS companies are kind of like that, or something that's much broader and bigger and more horizontal. But your relationship with between the customer and the vendor is much broader and more difficult to turn into a transactional kind of a thing. And so I think that is always a key decision that any great B2B tech company has to make, is that how narrow and transactional and focused they want to be, and how broad and aspirational they want to be.
Interesting. And I think you have done this thing multiple times. Like, you have been successful and a lot of interesting stuff you have achieved. So in your journey in Tamr, like, what are some of the big surprises that you still sort of said getting in, I know I figured it out, but then you realize, nah.
I've left enterprise technology a couple of times, almost, and probably one of the biggest pain points for me has always been the cost and the duration of the sales cycles that are involved. And I think it's a problem both with how technology companies sell in B2B, as well as how the customers buy. And so that for me is a constant pain point. And I wish I could say that it's changed a lot in the decades I've been doing this, but it really hasn't. And it's still very expensive and very painful, and both painful for the customers as well as for the vendors. And I sure hope that we're going to get out of this cycle at some point, but I don't see any end in sight. And part of it is, running a large company, any big company, is a very difficult thing. And these big companies, they kind of have most of the software and the technical infrastructure that they need. And so I think one of the things that makes it especially hard nowadays is that the customers really need help integrating things and bringing together. We like to say at Tamr all the time that our job is to really enable these companies to take advantage of all the data that they already have, and hopefully spending a relatively small amount of money in order to get a big value very, very quickly. And so, there was a point at which companies didn't have network routers and they needed them, and they didn't have databases and they needed them. But it's kind of not like that anymore. Most big companies, they actually have a lot of shelfware, software that they don't use in any way, shape, or form. And so there's like a glut of software at a lot of these companies. And I think really great next gen enterprise tech companies, they're part of their value prop is enabling their customers to get value out of the technology and the data and everything that already exists. Standing on the shoulders of all that stuff and turning it into something valuable very quickly. Yeah.
Interesting. And now let's talk about like your sort of journey. So what are some of the 1 to 3 traits that has helped you as an individual stay sane throughout this progression and stay tuned in? Like what are some of the sort of fabric that you can share?
Well, my partner Mike and I did this edX course at one point about how to start software companies from our perspective. And one of the interesting moments, they interviewed us separately, and they asked each one of us, like, well, what do you appreciate about the other person, right? Well, Andy, what do you appreciate about Mike? And Mike, what do you appreciate about Andy? And we actually said the mirror image. My statement about Mike was that even though he's an academic computer scientist and has done commercial startups, like I think his business intuition and his business sense is amazing. And he's more qualified to do, on the business side than anyone would ever probably give him credit. And when they interviewed him about me, he said, well, Andy's actually way more technical than anyone would guess for a founder CEO. And so I think, for me, I really love the tech. I love the engineering. I love software. I get paid to play with computers all day and work with people that play with computers. And if I wasn't getting paid, I'd still be doing the same kinds of stuff. And so, I've always been a mission-driven person. I love working with technology. From the moment I touched the keyboard in 7th grade, I fell in love with the idea of working on software. So, I think that has, for me, always been a core, because these startups that we do and these projects we do have a lot of risk in them, and most things fail. And, you have to be really tolerant of failure. And one of the things easier to tolerate failure is if you love what you're doing and you actually like the work itself. If the project you're on or the startup you're on doesn't really work out, you're like, oh, well, you always want it to be successful. But if it doesn't, you're like, well, it was a good shot on goal. And so I think that kind of an attitude, if you're doing this early stage stuff, it's really kept me emotionally healthy through the process. Because if all you want to do is make money, there are much easier ways to make money than starting software.
Interesting. And thank you so much, Andy. So we're almost at the tail end of the conversation. So one thing we ask all of our guests is to share their favorite reads or say their favorite books that they could share with our listeners or viewers. So like, do you have some of your favorite reads that you can share?
Yes. My favorite book right now is Enlightenment Now, which thanks to Bill Gates for promoting it. I'm through my 2nd or maybe 3rd read now, and like it's fantastic. And as a data guy, Pinker, like he does an amazing job of bringing data to life and using data to tell stories. And with all the crazy things that are going on in the world, to have this context that our world is actually becoming a much better place every single year, even though you not realize that when you watch the news. It's a fantastic book. I really, Enlightenment Now is absolutely amazing. And then the other one, I'm also a science fiction freak. And one of my other favorites in the last few years has been The 3-Body Problem, which is written by a Chinese science fiction author. Really great book and a great series, and a huge fan of 3-Body Problem. And I think they're going to make a movie now, so I'm really looking forward to that.
Interesting. And so last but not the least, we definitely want your perspective on our listeners and viewers, if they want to take away from this conversation and what you're seeing in the ecosystem. What would that be? Like, if you can give your closing remark, in sort of enlightening other sort of future leaders on sort of your journey and what they can take away from the conversation?
Well, I think, a lot of people spend their time worrying about, well, what's the next wave? What's the next thing to hit the beach? And in the last 10 or 15 years in technology, we kind of, this Hadoop wave kind of hit the beach, and that created a bunch of stuff. And then the data science and Spark wave kind of hit the beach. I think the next, wave to hit the beach is going to be data ops, and that it's a very natural thing for us to figure out how to process all this data in a more automated and model-driven way. And so, as people are thinking about what to work on over the next 5-10 years, I really believe that the principles behind data ops is a good place to invest your time, energy, and effort.
Interesting. With that said, Andy, again, thank you so much for coming to our show and speaking your heart out about your journey, about sort of what's going on in the ecosystem. Wish you nothing but success in the success of Tamr. Looking for a, again, big hairy exit in Boston ecosystem. So thank you so much, and you're always welcome back on the podcast to share your journey, to share sort of your other successful areas. And again, thank you very much for your entire support in the entrepreneurial community and whatever you're doing to support other entrepreneurs. That was really, really, really helpful, and we need folks like you so that there's a lot more churning going on, creating interesting stuff for everyone.
Well, thanks, Vishal. It's always great to see you and great to catch up, and look forward to doing it again.
Awesome.
I thought I was sick of home, but actually I was homesick. Never really knew that I would have to grow up so quick. I'm so uncomfortable, don't know anybody here. Just a couple dudes that I met once, that's it. And I go into the booth feeling nervous. Got butterflies in my stomach like I'm so worthless. Is the mic on? I don't know how to work this. Inside I'm breaking down, I hope I'm not up on the